Every camera in Romano Mansion was watching. No one below the stairs knew that yet. In the grand ballroom, beneath a chandelier that scattered light like broken glass, a maid barely out of her teens knelt in front of the one child in New York. No servant was permitted to touch. Her arms opened. The room seemed to stop breathing with her. Somewhere above, in a security office lined with monitors, Vincent Romano set down his coffee and did not move. The bodyguards near the ballroom doors reached, out of pure instinct, for weapons they wouldn't need. The head housekeeper's hand flew to her mouth. Behind her, an old butler went rigid, waiting for the scream that always came when someone got too close to Isabella Romano. It never came. Instead, the girl who had not let anyone touch her in 2 years turned her face into the maid's shoulder and broke. No one in that ballroom understood yet that they were watching the moment that would unravel the Romano Empire from the inside and rebuild it into something none of them recognized. Rewind 6 hours. Lily Carter had learned a long time ago that the world rarely warns you before it changes. She was 20 minutes early for a job interview. She'd almost talked herself out of standing on a subway platform in a coat too thin for the wind coming off the East River, rehearsing the same sentence in her head. You are qualified. You have done this before. She had, just never for a family like this one. At home, in the cramped apartment she shared with her 17-year-old brother Ethan, there was a stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter that she didn't need to open to know what they said. Ethan wanted to be a doctor. Lily wanted, more than anything, to make sure that dreams survived contact with their bank account. When the posting for a live-in housekeeper at the Romano estate had appeared, nearly triple the going rate, references not strictly required, she had told herself it was simply generous. She had not let herself ask why it was so generous. Not yet. The gates alone should have told her. They rose taller than any building she'd lived in, wrought iron folding back in silence to let a single town car glide up a driveway lined with topiary trimmed into shapes too precise to be anything but expensive. Beyond them, the mansion waited. White stone, floor to ceiling windows. A fountain throwing up mist that caught the afternoon light, like something staged for a photograph. It was beautiful in the specific way that made Lily's stomach tighten instead of settle. Beautiful and wrong. She just didn't know why yet. A woman in her 50s met her at the door, silver hair pinned back with military precision, eyes that swept over Lily once, cataloguing her, before softening by half a degree. "Margaret," she said, "head of household staff. You're punctual. Good. Mr. Romano values punctuality." Lily followed her through a foyer with ceilings 3 stories high, past a butler named Charles, who nodded without quite meeting her eyes past a broad-shouldered man near the staircase. Dante Margaret called him Chief of Security, though nothing about the mansion's decor suggested it needed one, who watched her the way you'd watch a stranger holding something breakable. Nobody smiled. Not once. In the whole walk to the staff office, Lily had worked in enough houses to know that silence could mean many things. Exhaustion, discipline, grief. This silence had a shape to it. Careful, practiced, like everyone inside these walls had learned, a long time ago, exactly how loud they were allowed to be. Margaret closed the office door behind them before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice dropped low enough that Lily had to lean in. Before anything else, there is one rule in this house that matters more than every other rule combined. She held Lily's gaze. You will never touch Miss Isabella. You will not speak to her, unless she speaks first. If Mr. Romano ever sees you break that rule. Margaret paused, and for the first time something moved behind her. Composed expression, something close to fear. There is nothing I could do to help you. Is she? Lily hesitated. Is she dangerous? No. Margaret's answer came too fast, too flat. She is fragile, and fragile things in this house are protected the way other men protect their fortunes. A beat. The last girl who tried to comfort her lasted 3 minutes in this position. I'd advise you to last longer. Lily wanted to ask what had happened in those 3 minutes. She didn't. By late afternoon, she understood the warning was not exaggeration. The mansion, for all its marble and gold leaf, felt like a held breath. Maids moved through the halls on soft-soled shoes. Eyes down, a tray of food was left outside a closed door on the second floor and collected, untouched half the time. An hour later, nobody knocked on that door. Nobody lingered near it. Once crossing the east corridor with an armful of linens, Lily caught a glimpse through a half-open doorway. A small figure in a cream-colored dress, dark glasses pushed up against pale light from the window. A white cane resting against the arm of a chair. A scarf clutched in both hands, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The girl didn't turn, didn't seem to register that anyone had passed at all. She simply doesn't like strangers, Lily told herself, and kept walking because that explanation was easier to carry than the alternative, that something in this house had taught a child that no one was coming. So there was no point turning to look. It was nearly 6 when Lily found her again, alone this time, curled into the deep window seat of the ballroom, where the last light of the day pooled gold across the floor. Small shoulders shaking, no sound at all. Lily would learn later that even her crying had gone silent, trained out of her the way everything else had. But the shape of grief doesn't need volume to be unmistakable. Every warning Margaret had given her rose up at once. Never touch her. Never speak first. There is nothing I could do to help you. Lily thought of Ethan, of every frightened child she'd ever knelt beside in every foster placement that hadn't lasted, of the particular cruelty of leaving someone to cry with an entire house of adults, close enough to hear it, and too afraid to move. She crossed the ballroom anyway. She knelt in front of the girl, slow enough not to startle her, and for a moment neither of them moved. "I know they told me not to touch you," Lily said quietly, closing the last of the distance between them. But no child should cry alone. She opened her arms. Somewhere above the ballroom, a monitor flickered, and a man who had not stood up from his desk in 3 years without a reason rose to his feet without one at all. For a moment, nothing in the ballroom moved. Lily felt the girl go rigid in her arms, the way a body braces for pain it has learned to expect, and she almost pulled back, almost apologized, almost undid the whole thing before it began. Every rule Margaret had given her screamed at once. Never touch her. There is nothing I could do to help you. Then Isabella broke. Not away from her, into her. Small hands fisted into the back of Lily's uniform, gripping so hard her knuckles went white, and the sound that came out of the girl was not the polite, contained crying of a child who'd been told to be quiet. It was raw, ugly. 2 years of silence tearing loose all at once, shoulders heaving, breath catching on itself, a scarf that had never left her hands now crushed between them like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind Lily, she heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath, heard Charles murmur something under his breath. When she glanced up, she found the old butler's eyes wet, and Dante, the security chief who'd looked at her like breakable glass just hours before, standing with his jaw-tight gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling to let anyone see his face right now. None of them moved to stop her. None of them had ever seen Isabella cry like this. Not once. Not since the funeral. And something about finally seeing it. After 2 years of a silence so complete it had started to feel like the house itself was holding its breath, undid the staff faster than any scream could have. Lily didn't speak. She had learned, long before Romano Mansion, that some grief doesn't want words. It just wants someone to stay. So she stayed, knelt on the marble with her arms full of a child she'd been forbidden to touch, and let her cry until the sobs slowed into shudders, and the shudders slowed into something quieter, exhaustion maybe, or relief, or the strange calm that comes after a storm finally lets go of a house it's been sitting over for years. 3 floors up, Vincent Romano had not moved from the window of his office. He'd seen the maid cross the ballroom on the monitor. Before he'd fully registered what he was watching, his hand had gone to the intercom out of pure reflex. "Get her away from my daughter," and then stopped, hovering, because Isabella hadn't flinched. Isabella hadn't screamed. Isabella, who flinched from her own reflection some mornings, who hadn't let a hand touch her shoulder since the day they lowered her mother into the ground, was clinging to a stranger, like she'd been waiting 2 years for permission to fall apart. Vincent Romano built an empire on knowing exactly when to intervene and exactly when a single wrong move would cost him everything. He had never in his life felt less certain which this was. So he watched. He did not interrupt. He stood at that window for the better part of 10 minutes, with his knuckles pale against the sill, and when Isabella finally quieted, when she lifted her streaked face from the maid's shoulder and, for the first time in 2 years, looked like a child instead of a ghost living in his house, Something in his chest cracked open that he'd bricked over the day his wife died. He picked up the phone. "Bring the maid to my office," he said. His voice gave nothing away. It never did. Word moved through Romano Mansion faster than Lily could climb the stairs behind Dante. By the time she reached the office door, she could feel it in the way the staff avoided her eyes in the hallway. Not scorn, she realized. Grief on her behalf. They thought they were walking her to something final. She thought they might be right. Vincent Romano's office was exactly what she expected and nothing like it at once. Dark wood, a wall of glass overlooking the grounds, a desk with nothing on it but a single closed laptop and a framed photograph turned slightly away from the door. He was taller than the man she'd glimpsed in security footage suggested, broader through the shoulders, and when he turned from the window to look at her, his eyes weren't cruel. They were exhausted in a way she recognized. The particular exhaustion of someone who has spent years defending something they don't know how to fix. She waited for him to fire her. Worse. Instead, Vincent Romano asked her one question. "How did you make my daughter feel safe?" Lily hadn't expected honesty to be an option in this house. She gave it anyway. "I didn't treat her like the Mafia Boss's daughter." Her voice shook, but she didn't look away. "I treated her like a lonely little girl who needed someone to stop being afraid of her long enough to hold her." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Lily was certain she'd said the one thing that would get her thrown out of the estate by morning. Vincent said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a different man than the one who'd walked in, "No one in this house has said anything true to me in 3 years. He didn't fire her." By the end of that conversation, Lily Carter was no longer a housekeeper. She was Isabella Romano's personal caregiver, effective immediately, and Vincent Romano, a man whose name made grown men reach for their weapons on instinct, had thanked her. That evening, Isabella refused dinner. A tray was left outside her door, as it always was, and it sat untouched, as it always did, while Margaret hovered nearby with the resigned patience of someone who had stopped hoping months ago. Lily knocked once, and let herself in without waiting for permission she knew wouldn't come. She didn't ask Isabella to eat. She simply sat down across from her on the floor, back against the wall, and waited. 10 minutes later, without a word, Isabella reached for the tray. Charles, passing the doorway on his rounds, stopped so abruptly he nearly dropped the stack of towels in his arms. He said nothing. He didn't need to. By the next morning, every member of the household staff would know. The girl who hadn't eaten a full meal without a fight in months had cleared her plate. Sitting 3 feet from a maid, nobody had asked to save her. That night, as Lily tucked a blanket around her and turned to leave, a small voice stopped her at the door. Quiet, rusted from disuse, barely more than breath. One word. The first Isabella Romano had spoken in 2 years. "Lily, Lily." The word hung in the dark of the room longer than it had any right to. Lily stayed frozen by the door, half-turned, afraid that if she moved too fast, she'd break whatever fragile thing had just cracked open. "I'm right here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Isabella didn't answer again that night. She didn't need to. Something had shifted, and in the weeks that followed, that single word became the first thread in what slowly unraveled 2 years of silence. By the second week, the mansion had started, cautiously, to sound like a house with a child in it. Lily found old watercolor sets in a hallway closet nobody had opened since before Isabella lost her mother, and the two of them spent an afternoon painting on the terrace. Isabella's fingers guided by touch and memory, describing colors from smell and texture the way she'd learned to before her world had gone dark. Lily narrated every stroke of her own brush out loud, unprompted, until it became a habit neither of them commented on. There were books read aloud in the library, Lily's voice doing every character until Isabella started supplying her own, correcting the pitch of a villain's laugh with the first hint of teasing anyone had heard from her in years. There was a disastrous flour-covered afternoon in the kitchen trying to bake cookies which ended with more dough on the counters than in the oven, and the first full, unguarded laugh anyone in that house had heard out of Isabella Romano since her mother's funeral. Margaret cried in the pantry that day. She thought no one saw. Charles saw. He didn't tell anyone either. There was a piano in the east sitting room that hadn't been touched in 3 years, and Lily, who could barely manage a scale, sat beside Isabella while the girl found the keys by memory, hesitant at first, then steadier, filling a room that had been silent for so long it had started to feel like a museum. And every night, without fail, there were bedtime stories. Isabella began asking for them by name. Slowly, the mansion itself seemed to exhale. Maids who'd spent 2 years speaking in whispers started laughing again in the hallways. Dante, who'd guarded a silent child for so long he'd forgotten what smiling looked like on her face, started finding reasons to walk past the garden in the afternoons just to watch her laughing at something Lily had said. Even Vincent changed. He started appearing at dinner, not summoned, not announced, just there at the head of a table that had sat 2 empty chairs for 3 years, listening to his daughter describe her day in a voice that grew steadier by the week. Meetings that once ran until midnight began ending early. Advisors who were used to his undivided attention found themselves more than once waiting on a decision because the boss had gone to hear a bedtime story instead. "You understand what you are doing to this family," Margaret said to Lily one evening, watching Vincent carry a half-asleep Isabella up the stairs himself for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. "I'm not doing anything," Lily said. "I'm just staying." Margaret only smiled, the way people smile at something they don't quite believe is real yet, in case believing it makes it disappear. Not everyone was smiling. Outside the gates of Romano Mansion, in rooms far less warm, other men were watching too. It had taken less than 3 weeks for whispers to travel the particular underground channels that mafia families used instead of headlines. Vincent Romano, a man who had built his reputation on never letting anything or anyone close enough to matter, was cancelling meetings, missing calls, delaying decisions his rivals had learned to fear precisely because he never delayed them. A man was paid quietly to sit outside the estate with a long lens for 3 days before he got what he needed. A single photograph taken through the iron bars of the front gate, of a laughing girl in the garden and the young maid crouched beside her, hands cupped around something small and alive she was showing the child. The photograph moved through channels that never touched daylight. By the time it reached the men who mattered, it had a caption that needed no explanation. "The Romano boss finally has a weakness." Lily knew none of this. She only knew that the mansion felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, like somewhere a person could breathe. It was late one evening, well past Isabella's bedtime, when Lily found herself wandering a wing of the mansion she hadn't yet explored, searching, if she was honest, for nothing in particular, except the quiet that came after a good day. The hallway ended at a set of double doors, unlike any others in the house. No gilt, no polish. Dust along the frame, thick enough that it hadn't been disturbed in years, and a lock on the outside where every other door in the mansion locked from within. She was still standing there, hand halfway to the handle, when Margaret's voice came from behind her, quieter than Lily had ever heard it. "You shouldn't be here." Lily turned. Margaret's face, usually so composed, had gone pale in the low light. "What is this win?" Lily asked. Margaret was quiet long enough that Lily thought she wouldn't answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something close to reverence, or fear. Lily couldn't tell which. That wing belonged to Mrs. Romano. She glanced once toward the shadows at the end of the hall, as though the dark itself might be listening. "No one has opened those doors since the day she died," she left without another word, footsteps fading quickly down the corridor, as if she regretted having said even that much. Lily stood alone in the dark, staring at the lock. She knew she should walk away, knew that whatever waited behind those doors wasn't hers to find. She reached out anyway and turned the handle. It gave. The door swung inward on hinges that hadn't moved in 3 years, and the smell hit Lily before anything else did. Dust-old wood polish, and beneath it, faint as a memory, the ghost of perfume that had long since stopped being worn by anyone. She stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. Moonlight came through tall windows draped in sheets, catching dust motes that hung suspended in the air like the room itself had been paused mid-breath. Furniture sat under white cloths shaped like the ghosts of chairs and tables. On the walls, portraits watched her from behind a fine grey film. A woman with Isabella's same striking eyes, laughing in one frame, cradling an infant in another. Mrs. Romano. Lily had never once heard anyone in the house say her first name. Near the window, a child's drawings were still pinned to a corkboard, curling at the edges. Stick figures. A house with too many windows. A little girl and her mother holding hands beneath a crayon sun. Lily's throat tightened at the date scrawled in the corner. 3 weeks before the accident that took Isabella's mother from her. This wasn't a room that had been closed. It had been sealed, like a wound someone was afraid to look at. She should have left then. She told herself that later, after everything, she should have turned around and walked back out and never told a soul what she'd found. Instead, she crossed to the writing desk in the corner drawn by something she couldn't name and found a stack of leather journals tucked beneath a false bottom in the lower drawer, hidden with the kind of care that only makes sense if you're hiding something from someone who's looking for it. She opened the first one, and the past 3 weeks fell away. The handwriting was elegant, hurried in places, calm in others, a woman's private thoughts, never meant for anyone. Early entries were ordinary, a wedding anniversary, a worry about Isabella's eyesight beginning to fail, a small joke about Vincent working too late. Then, gradually, the tone changed. Someone in this house is not who Vincent believes them to be. I've said nothing. I don't know who to trust with what I've seen. Only that it isn't him. It's someone close. Someone he'd never suspect because he trusts them the way he trusts almost no one else. Later still, the handwriting grew tighter, more urgent, as if written in stolen minutes. I think they know I've noticed. I think I'm not safe in my own home, and I cannot say why without sounding as though grief and fear have made me imagine things. But I am not imagining this. The final entry stopped Lily's breath entirely. If anything happens to me, never trust. The page had been torn away, clean and deliberate, right at the edge of the binding. Whatever name had followed those words was gone. Lily sat frozen with the journal open in her lap, the mansion utterly silent around her. And for the first time since arriving at Romano Mansion, she understood that the fear soaked into every corner of this house hadn't started with Isabella's silence. It had started with a woman who knew, before she died, that someone close to her husband wanted her gone, and never got the chance to say who. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Lily's blood went cold. She had no time to think, only to move, sliding behind the heavy drapery along the far wall as the door she'd left unlocked eased open behind her. Through a gap in the fabric, she watched a shadow slip into the room, careful, purposeful. Not the movement of someone who'd stumbled in by accident. The movement of someone searching for something specific, sweeping a small flashlight across the desk, the drawers, the floor where Lily had been sitting only seconds before. She didn't dare breathe. The shadow found what it was looking for. Or didn't. She couldn't tell in the dark. Could only watch her gloved hand pass once more over the desk before the figure retreated the way it came, closing the door with the same careful silence it had entered with. Lily counted a full 60 seconds before she moved. The journals were gone. Every single one, taken from beneath the false bottom where she'd found them, as though someone had known exactly where to look, or had simply followed her there. Someone knows I found them. The thought settled into her chest like ice water. Whoever had entered that room hadn't stumbled onto a secret. They'd come to retrieve one they already knew existed, and they had done it minutes after Lily left it exposed. She didn't sleep that night. In the morning, when she finally worked up the courage to tell Vincent what she'd found, the room, the journals, the torn page, the shadow in the dark, she watched something in his face close like a door being locked from the inside. He asked no questions. He simply thanked her quietly and told her to speak of it to no one else in the house. What Lily didn't see in the days that followed was the change in Vincent Romano behind closed office doors. Old security footage pulled and reviewed frame by frame. Financial records requested under names that meant nothing to anyone but him. A list of every person who'd had access to that wing narrowing night after night until it fit on a single line. He said nothing to anyone. Not yet. A man who'd spent his life around traitors knew better than to accuse one before he was certain, and knew better than anyone that a traitor cornered too soon was a traitor who struck first. Somewhere inside the house, Lily had spent 3 weeks learning to call safe. Someone else understood exactly what she'd found in that room and exactly how dangerous a maid with a dead woman's secrets had just become. 2 evenings later, walking back from the garden gate after seeing Isabella off to bed, Lily paused to adjust the collar of her coat against the cold. A single red dot bloomed silently against the fabric over her heart. and was gone before she even understood what she'd seen. Lily never heard the shot. What she felt was the impossible weight of a body slamming into hers, driving her sideways off her feet a half-second before the world cracked open with sound. She hit the gravel hard. Air punched from her lungs, and it took her a full breath to understand that the arms wrapped around her, shielding her from the ground and everything above it, belonged to Vincent Romano. "Stay down," he said against her ear. Low and absolutely steady. The voice of a man who had done this before and would do it again without hesitation. Behind them, Dante was already shouting orders into a radio. Security pouring across the grounds like the mansion itself had come alive. By the time Lily was pulled back inside, hands shaking, ears still ringing, the gates of Romano Mansion had already begun closing in a way she'd never seen. Steel shutters lowering over the ground floor windows. A second wave of guards taking up positions she hadn't known existed. Vincent didn't leave her side that night. "You should send me away," Lily said quietly, once her hands had finally stopped trembling enough to hold a cup of tea Margaret had pressed into them. "I've put a target on this house." "You put a target on yourself the moment you saved my daughter's life," Vincent said. He was standing at the window, watching the grounds with the flat, terrible focus of a man calculating how many ways he could still lose someone. "The house has always had one. That isn't new. You are. Then let me go home. To my brother. Somewhere far from." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd heard from him before, and when he turned to face her, something in his expression had cracked open in a way she hadn't seen since the ballroom. "Isabella doesn't sleep through the night without you anymore. She eats because you sit beside her. She speaks, Lily, for the first time in 2 years, because you decided a rule wasn't worth more than a frightened child." He exhaled, and for a moment, the most feared man in New York simply looked exhausted. "I am not asking you to stay because it's convenient. I'm asking because I don't know how to give my daughter back her silence, and I'm not willing to try." Lily didn't leave. In the weeks that followed, something between them shifted into a shape neither of them named out loud. Not romance, nothing like it, but something steadier. Trust, earned in small pieces. Vincent began speaking to her plainly, the way he spoke to almost no one in that house. She began recognizing the specific quiet that came before he asked her opinion on something, and the specific quiet that came after Isabella had fallen asleep in his arms when he'd sit a while longer just to watch her breathe. He had started, without either of them fully realizing it, to treat her like family. The men who had missed once did not intend to miss twice with the same plan. 3 weeks after the shot in the garden, Lily took the train into the city on her day off, the way she did every other week, to see Ethan. Security had wanted to send a car. She'd insisted on the train. One small piece of her old life she refused to let this new one swallow whole. She never made it to her brother's door. The last thing she remembered clearly was a van pulling alongside her on a quiet side street 2 blocks from the apartment, and a hand closing over her mouth before she could make a sound. The message reached Romano Mansion before dawn. No ransom note, no theatrics, just a single photograph delivered to Vincent's private line and a demand attached beneath it. 3 territories signed over by week's end, or the girl wouldn't be found at all. The room full of advisors Vincent called at 4 in the morning was united on exactly one point. "You cannot surrender territory for a housekeeper," Marco Bellini said, arms folded, the calm certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own value in that room. "Whatever sentiment has taken hold of this house, she is not worth the empire your father built." "She's only a maid," someone else echoed, quieter, careful of Vincent's face. Vincent had not raised his voice once since the meeting began. He raised it now. "She is not only anything." He stood, and the room went silent, the way rooms always went silent around him. But this time it wasn't fear alone driving it. "My daughter spoke for the first time in 2 years because that girl refused to leave her crying alone in a room every one of you walked past. She has more courage than half the men in this house, and she has earned more loyalty from this family than most of you ever will." He looked around the table, meeting every eye that dared to hold his. "She is family, and I am not in the business of leaving family behind." He didn't wait for consensus. By sunrise, every asset Vincent Romano controlled, men, money, information networks built over 2 decades, had been turned toward a single objective, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, the boss led the operation himself. They tracked the van to an abandoned warehouse on the waterfront by mid-morning, working through channels that answered to fear faster than they answered to law. Vincent went in with the first wave, Dante at his shoulder, moving through the building floor by floor with the kind of controlled violence that had built his reputation in the first place. They found the room where Lily had been held. Chair overturned. They found the guard posted outside it, unconscious, a wound already going purple along his jaw. Evidence of a struggle, evidence of a struggle, evidence someone had fought their way free. What they didn't find, anywhere in that warehouse, floor by floor, room by room, until the building had been cleared entirely and gone silent around them, was Lily. She was gone. She was gone from the warehouse. She was not gone for long. A second location surfaced within hours. A shipping container yard, 3 miles east, flagged by a contact inside the rival family's own network who valued self-preservation more than loyalty. Once Vincent Romano's full attention turned toward finding whoever had taken her. This time, when Vincent went through the door first, he found what he'd been afraid he wouldn't. Lily, alive, bruised, exhausted, one wrist bound to a chair with rope she'd nearly worked loose on her own by the time they reached her, but alive. He didn't remember crossing the room. He remembered only kneeling in front of her, cutting the last of the rope with hands that weren't quite steady, and the sound she made when she finally let herself cry. She recovered slowly in the days that followed, tucked into a guest room down the hall from Isabella's, who refused to sleep anywhere else until Lily was well enough to sit up on her own. The physical injuries healed faster than Lily expected. What lingered longer were the fragments. Sounds and shapes from the hours she'd spent blindfolded in that first warehouse before she'd fought her way loose. Pieces of memory that surfaced without warning while she was doing something as ordinary as drinking tea. It was on the third evening, half asleep, that one of those fragments sharpened into something she couldn't unhear. A voice, low, giving instructions to the men holding her, familiar in a way that made her stomach drop the instant she placed it. It was Marco, she told Vincent the next morning, hands wrapped tight around a cup she wasn't drinking from. I know his voice. I've heard it in every meeting you've held in that office for weeks. It was him. Vincent's face didn't change. That, more than anything, told her how much it cost him not to let it. Marco has been at my side for 15 years, he said, quiet and controlled. He was at my wedding. He held Isabella the day she was born. He shook his head, not in dismissal but in something closer to refusal. The particular stubbornness of a man defending the one relationship he'd never once questioned. You were drugged, exhausted, blindfolded in the dark. A voice can sound like anyone's under those conditions. Lily didn't argue further. She'd learned in her weeks in that house that some doors close harder than others. And Marco Bellini's had been bolted shut by 15 years of trust. Vincent wasn't ready to pull apart on the word of a maid who'd been through hell. She was right not to argue. The evidence, when it came, didn't need her word at all. It started small, a discrepancy in a shipment ledger that Vincent's chief accountant flagged almost apologetically, certain it was clerical error. Then a second discrepancy, tracing back through accounts that had no business existing at all, routed through shell companies with Marco Bellini's fingerprints buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork. Then a phone, unregistered, hidden inside a false panel in Marco's own study, discovered during a routine security sweep Vincent had ordered of every room in the house without exception, including the ones belonging to men he trusted. The messages on it went back years. Vincent read every one of them alone in his office, long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. And by the time he finished, the man he'd trusted for 15 years had become someone he no longer recognized at all. It hadn't started with Lily. It hadn't even started with Isabella's mother's death. Not really. It had started years earlier, with Marco watching Vincent build an empire he believed he deserved a larger share of, and deciding, quietly, that grief made men easier to control than strength ever would. He had arranged the accident that took Isabella's mother's life. Not personally. Marco was too careful for that, but through hands paid well enough to keep silent, and a cover story clean enough that no one in Vincent's inner circle had ever thought to question it. He had watched Vincent grieve for 3 years, had comforted him through it, had positioned himself closer and closer to the center of a family, broken exactly the way he needed it to be, patient, the way only someone playing a decades-long game could afford to be. Isabella's silence had made her unreachable, which made Vincent unreachable, which had suited Marco perfectly. Until Lily walked into a ballroom and undid 2 years of careful isolation in a single afternoon. She hadn't just healed a child. She'd woken Vincent back up, made him present, engaged, harder to manipulate, and in doing that, without ever knowing it, she had become the one obstacle standing between Marco Bellini and everything he'd spent years working toward. The final entries on the hidden phone left nothing to interpretation. A plan already in motion, timed to the upcoming Romano Foundation charity gala. The one night of the year when Vincent's guard came down enough to fill his home with strangers. Kidnap Isabella in the chaos, frame Lily for it, using the very trust she'd built with the girl against her. Destroy what remained of Vincent Romano in a single night, leaving him with nothing and no one left to suspect but a maid he'd chosen to believe over his oldest friend. Vincent closed the laptop slowly and sat in the dark of his office for a long time before he moved again. The gala went ahead as planned. Vincent insisted on it. Better, he reasoned, to draw Marco into the open on a night Vincent controlled every inch of, bent tip his hand and let his oldest friend disappear before this ended the way it needed to. Security had been quietly tripled. Every guard on the grounds now answered directly to Dante, and Dante alone. Every guest on the list had been re-verified twice. And still standing in the ballroom an hour before the first car arrived, watching the staff finish setting long tables beneath chandeliers polished bright enough to blind, Vincent understood the truth that made his chest go cold. He didn't know which of the smiling faces walking through his front door tonight could be trusted, and which had already been bought. The gala began exactly on schedule. Music, laughter, crystal, catching light across a room full of New York's wealthiest and most dangerous families, gathered together under one roof for one night. None of them aware how many lives in that room were about to change before midnight. Halfway through the second hour, without warning, every light in the ballroom went out at once. Darkness swallowed the ballroom whole, and for one suspended second, no one moved at all. Then the first smoke bomb went off near the terrace doors, and the silence tore apart. Screams erupted across the room as thick grey smoke rolled through the crowd. Guests stumbling over each other in the dark, crystal shattering somewhere overhead as one of the great chandeliers came loose and crashed the marble in a shower of light and glass. Gunfire cracked from somewhere near the east entrance. A single shot, then several. Security scrambling to find targets they couldn't see. Lily grabbed the nearest table for balance, heart slamming against her ribs, and did the only thing that mattered in that moment. She looked for Isabella. The girl had been standing beside her, not 60 seconds earlier, hand tucked into Lily's, listening to the orchestra with the quiet, unguarded pleasure of a child who no longer flinched at noise the way she once had. Now that hand was empty. Isabella? Lily's voice tore through the chaos, useless against the screaming and the smoke. She shoved through the crowd, fighting toward the staircase, and that was when she heard it. Faint, almost lost beneath the noise, but unmistakable. Crying from somewhere above. She ran. She found them in Isabella's bedroom, door standing open, moonlight cutting a pale line across the floor. Marco Bellini stood in the center of the room in a tailored suit that made him look, in the dim light, exactly like the trusted family friend he'd spent 15 years pretending to be. One hand gripped Isabella's arm hard enough that the girl's face was twisted in silent terror. The other hand held a gun, and for the first time since Lily had known him, his composure had cracked into something colder. "I didn't want it to come to this," Marco said, and had the nerve to sound almost sincere. "But you were never supposed to be difficult to remove. A maid. That's all you were meant to be. Let her go." Lily's voice didn't shake, though everything else in her did. "You have one choice, and you're going to make it quickly." Marco's grip tightened on Isabella's arm, and the girl whimpered, the sound cutting straight through Lily's chest. "Walk out that door, and let me finish what I came here for. Or stay, and watch what happens to her, because you couldn't." Lily didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, directly into the space between the gun and the child, close enough now that Marco would have to go through her to reach Isabella at all. "If you want her," Lily said, "you'll have to shoot me first." Something flickered across Marco's face. Surprise, maybe, that a maid he'd dismissed as insignificant would stand her ground against a loaded gun without flinching. It didn't slow him down. He fired. The sound was enormous in the small room, and pain bloomed white-hot through Lily's shoulder as the impact spun her half around. She didn't fall. Some instinct deeper than the pain kept her upright, kept her body angled between the gun and the girl behind her, one arm already reaching back to pull Isabella further from harm, even as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. That was the moment Vincent Romano came through the door. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. His daughter shaking against the wall, Lily bleeding and still standing between her and a gun. Marco Bellini, the man who'd stood beside him for 15 years, holding the weapon that had just fired, and something in Vincent Romano that had been carefully, deliberately controlled for 3 decades broke loose entirely. What followed was fast and brutal. Dante and 2 guards burst through the door seconds behind him. Marco fired twice more before Dante's shot took the gun from his hand, and the fight that followed left the room in ruins. Furniture overturned, a mirror shattered. Marco finally driven to his knees and disarmed as Vincent's fury very nearly cost the man his life before Dante's hand on his shoulder stopped him. It was Isabella's small, broken sob that stopped him, not Marco, his daughter. Vincent turned from the man who had murdered his wife and destroyed 3 years of his life and dropped to his knees instead, beside the maid who had bled to protect his daughter, Lily. His hands hovered over the wound in her shoulder, uncertain for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Stay with me. Stay awake." "Isabella," Lily managed, blood loss already pulling at the edges of her vision. "Is she's safe?" Vincent's voice cracked on the words. "Because of you. She's safe because of you." He gathered her carefully against him, pressing a hand hard over the wound. And for the first time since the day he'd buried his wife, Vincent Romano cried, openly, without shame, in front of his own security team, his daughter, and the girl who had walked into his home 4 months earlier and refused to leave a crying child alone. "You saved the only family I had left," he whispered. Months later, Lily recovered fully, though the scar on her shoulder never quite faded, a mark she'd come to think of in time as something closer to a badge than a wound. Marco Bellini's empire within the Romano organization was dismantled within weeks. What Vincent did with the rest of it surprised nearly everyone who had known him. Territory by territory, he began stepping back from the world that had defined his family for 3 generations, redirecting the fortune he'd spent decades building towards something his wife would have recognized far more than the empire ever had. Grief counseling centers for children, support programs for kids moving through foster care the way Lily once had, resources for families quietly falling apart the way his own nearly had. Romano Mansion changed too. The abandoned wing was reopened, aired out, filled with light again. The silence that had once defined every hallway, slowly and then all at once, to the ordinary noise of a house where a child was allowed to be happy. On the evening, the Isabella Hope Foundation opened its doors for the first time. Vincent stood before a crowded room and told a story he'd once believed he'd never be able to tell anyone. How wealth and fear had failed his daughter for 3 years, and how one act of defiant kindness from a young woman he'd almost had dismissed had done what neither could. He called Lily to the stage. Isabella walked up beside her, no longer hesitant, no longer hiding behind anyone's shadow, and took Lily's hand in front of the entire room. "You're my family," she said, clear and steady and unafraid. The room rose to its feet as Vincent wrapped his arms around them both, and somewhere in that applause was the answer to everything the story had asked from its very first page, that the hug everyone had warned against became the one that broke a child's silence, exposed a conspiracy 15 years in the making, redeemed a father hardened by grief, and proved in the end that the greatest courage a person can offer isn't found in power or violence at all. It's found in choosing compassion, especially when everyone else chooses fear.